Peter Nelson, an independent consultant working on SEA. I'd like to follow the theme, actually, that Ben Cave has just presented to us, because, of course, we like to hold the banks responsible for the problems that we're all currently facing, lack of change in the back pocket, basically because they chose to take too many risks with things like subprime mortgages. We're talking here about the need for equator principles and the way that World Bank operates social, economic, and environmental safeguards. And there's a large focus all the time on how we regulate to make sure that we don't cause damage to the environment. And here we have our keynote presenter today, giving us what actually sounds like a very, very threatening message indeed. And frankly, if we're going to continue to take a very cautious, very regulatory approach to a lot of the issues that are rising on climate change, to quote the words that we used earlier, we don't have a hope in hell. So the question I really want to put, and it's very much directed at Courtney, is what scope is there for the banks to revisit this issue about how assessment risks are made on major types of new development that are required to actually combat and to adapt to climate change? It's coming. We've got to be much more proactive in everything we do. And at the moment, I sense we're still being very negative. What I think strategic assessment brings to the process is that much wider view, much wider vision of the changes we've got to make. That is going to require vast amounts of capital. How are we going to unlock that capital resource to develop the goods? Thanks.
That's an interesting question, mostly because I see SEA very much in, or largely in the realm of the public sector. So I do think it's, you know, I was talking to a colleague about how we could encourage the private sector to collaborate more in SEA and share resources for companies that are operating in a given geography to actually do a strategic environmental assessment to look at both the risks and the impacts. Go ahead, please.
Do you mind if I just join you in a bit of a dialogue there? Because
yeah, no, absolutely.
I think that's absolutely fair. It is largely public agencies. But for example, where we're looking at very major investment strategies, and I'm thinking specifically here about the Nile Basin, and about billions of dollars of investment that are required to manage the whole resource, water, agriculture, health, right across all the sectors. Basically, it's going to be private sector finance that comes in, underpinning those major investments. At the present time, we're operating SEA rules, equator principles, looking at the quality of the work that's being done. We're not turning the argument on its head, saying what do we have to do to deal with climate change adaptation. So I don't think it's just the public sector. I'm convinced it's the private sector too.
Yeah, the challenge is that the private sector capital comes in piecemeal to a large degree. I mean, I think what you're talking about is a whole number of projects, a whole host of development happening. And it's, you know, the way the financial sector works is we look for leverage points. So we have leverage in a single financing with a single client, with a single project in most cases. Sometimes it's more than one project, but it's hard to have any kind of leverage, say, with an adjacent company that's, or the other development in the region, unless we're taking part in the financing of that as well. I think it's an excellent question. I would be more than interested in exploring ways that we could promote SEA within the financial sector.
Jonathan Pritchard for Infrastructure Canada. I just have a question, but I'm going to give a little round of information beforehand. A lot of information's come out has been about the economic crisis, the global economic crisis, and how we've been putting a lot of money forward, and Peter mentioned that the money is the center of the universe now because of this issues that happened in the last couple of years. Climate change, the environment has taken a a back burner issue in terms of dealing with how do we move past the economic crisis? How do we promote job creation and money into the private sector as well as the public sector? And the backbone has been that the governments have put money forward to stimulate. Coming from Infrastructure Canada, we've done a lot of stimulating in our economy by having wastewater treatment plants, having roads, bridges, construction. As Bob Watson had mentioned, in 30 years from now, we might see the effect. How is the effect that we've done now with stimulus going to affect our dealings with climate change? And how do we use lessons learned from this economic crisis to make sure that this doesn't happen again and we incorporate climate change for the future? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Nicholas King. I'm the director of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. I just want to pose a question. One's a follow-up, Courtney, probably to you, about how willing or to entertain or already are entertaining the financial institutions the soft infrastructure required to adapt to climate change, the ecosystem-based adaptation Bob Watson mentioned, the building of artificial coral reefs to prevent storm surges, impacts, that sort of thing, rehabilitation, restoration of ecosystems, channeling rivers back into their floodplains as opposed to the hard infrastructures which cause so much of the problem now with the increase in flood peaks and so on. And then the second question is to Michael, as to what extent is the legal framework being developed around intergenerational equity and also the rights of the planet, such as being espoused by President Morales of Bolivia at the moment, because climate change is now starting to sort of telescope timescales down so dramatically. Thanks.
Well, I'll say that I think there's a huge amount of capacity building that has to take place. I think certainly I come from that background, so I think when banks understand, not only banks, but the private sector in general, the industry, private companies that are actually having the impact, when they understand what's happening when they impact an ecosystem service or an ecosystem and they lose that service, what the implications are for their business, for surrounding communities, they're very receptive. And that's actually, I think, a real way to influence companies and banks in looking at ecosystem services. But there's just a huge amount of capacity building, which is my primary task within the working group.
I just want to go back to this concept of the economic collapse and what happened to EA after that. And it ties into what Michael's been saying this morning about litigation. And it's got me thinking a little bit, and maybe we all need to think about this, is that after the collapse or the economic crisis, there was a relaxation of a number of countries around the world of the EA process so that economic stimulus packages could be advanced more quickly. And that's still going on in some of the OECD countries. And so Michael mentioned that there's going to be litigation, more litigation if policymakers and regulators really don't change the way that they look at the environment as a risk. And so I'm wondering, is that a good thing that EA is relaxed in an economic crisis that we're still in? So, a regulator sees this, oh, it's just form filling, and it's going to take 2 years to get the public participation process through, and it's for economic development, let's just get this thing going, right? But really, if a switched on bank says, well, wait just a minute, we actually want due diligence and we want due process here because we're investing $100 million in this infrastructure, and I don't care what you say, Mr. Government, we want to do it right because we've got the figures here, and storm surge, whatever you want to, whatever scenario. So what message can the banking industry give to governments and litigators give to governments that, look, you guys don't relax the EA system, strengthen the EA system, mold it, adapt it, make it more flexible to suit the sort of the era we're now in. It's not a situation as it was 25 years ago. Baseline information that exists today is up north in Canada. You might as well throw it the window. It's no good. So when you're building pipelines and roads and you're putting in billions of dollars in investment, then someone better know what that risk is. And if a regulator says, no, we're just going to do it because it's part of the economic stimulus package, well, I think that's irresponsible. So maybe we need to think about that. And Michael, you're sort of staring at me. I'm wondering, do you see that as a reasonable?
Well, it's certainly reasonable, but isn't that primarily the public sector's responsibility? I think that if a bank is given a lending opportunity, it's going to be a difficult choice for a bank to say, well, here's a big project that allows us to engage in a large transaction, but we're not going to do it because we think the permafrost is going to melt, and the government didn't think about that. That strikes me as a stretch.
Well, from my own dealings with other groups on this issue, the rights-based approach is not as effective as a responsibility-based approach. You do something because it's right to do, not because it says so in a regulation. It's the right thing to do. And that's, in my discussions with some of the banks, is that we do this not because it's good for business. Not because it says so in some form somewhere, we need to do this thing, and we do it because it's good for business. It's good for business,
but and it really gets into the other question about intergenerational equity. It may be good for business in the short term, but in 50 years things are going to sink. But in 50 years the loan will be fully amortized, and it just doesn't go into the calculation. And let me address the question of how the legal system is dealing with intergenerational equity and the rights of the planet. The short answer is very poorly. And traditionally, the legal system would deal with with temporarily remote things that aren't going to happen for quite some time, by just doing a net present value calculation, and your discount rate will largely determine how it comes out. And under most discount rates that are applied, something that happens a couple of generations ago, a couple of generations in the future, becomes a very small number and doesn't really count. And we are unfortunately seeing the institutionalization of that in a phenomenon in the US that has received very little attention, and that is the application of the social cost of carbon, coming up with calculations as part of the regulatory decision-making process about what are the costs and benefits of dealing with carbon regulation. And we're beginning to see that that can have a negative effect on carbon regulation, and it's almost the opposite of trying to achieve intergenerational equity. With respect to the rights of the planet, there are a lot of philosophical and moral and other writings on the importance of that, but they have not particularly been built into operative parts of the legal systems. There are declarations and international agreements like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that talk about that, but it doesn't get plugged into the actual enforceable terms. And until countries consent to being bound by those principles, it's not legally enforceable.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. May I
ask the one last question?
Sure.
Yeah, Shi Liang, True Asian Development Bank. Question for Professor Gerard and Ms. Lawrence. Increasingly, some of our clients are questioning about the disclosure system, which you mentioned about. And we wonder if for the legal and regulatory community and the Equator Bank's community, how do you address the disclosure issue on greenhouse gas if the national requirement doesn't mandate it?
Well, if the national requirement doesn't mandate it, the question is, will somebody else do that? And that could be the banks.
It's actually an interesting question. And I will say that there are a few investment banks who are looking at disclosure requirements of the various exchanges, and also looking at developing, good practice on how to address those types of risks in the disclosures of offering memoranda. So it's a sort of a new area, and we've had clients who are also interested in that as well.